The Park Inn Hotel in Penrith sits at the edge of a market town in Cumbria, 40 miles from the nearest major city. In the spring of 2022, it was home to 113 asylum seekers. The average cost to the British taxpayer for accommodating each of them was £129 per night. Most had been there for more than 6 months. Several had been there for over a year. The hotel had not been converted or adapted or redesigned for long-term habitation. It was a transit property, functioning rooms, a breakfast service, a car park. It had been contracted by the Home Office through one of the 3 private companies holding national asylum accommodation agreements, under an arrangement originally described in government documentation as an emergency contingency measure. By 2022, there were over 220 hotels like it across England, Scotland, and Wales. Together, they housed more than 37,000 people. The annual cost to the public had crossed £1 billion. Within 12 months, it would double. This was never meant to be permanent. The question at the center of this episode is not whether Britain should house asylum seekers. That is a policy argument with legitimate positions on every side. The question is more specific, and in some ways more troubling. How did a short-term contingency measure, introduced under genuine pressure with clear initial justification, evolve into a multi-billion-pound structural dependency that no single institution designed, no single minister controls, and no straightforward decision can dismantle? The answer involves procurement architecture, contractor incentives, a processing backlog measured in years, and the particular way that emergency spending, once embedded in public infrastructure, tends to resist reform. To understand how the system became what it is necessary to understand what it was responding to, and to take that response seriously before examining where it led. Between 2018 and 2020, the number of people arriving in the United Kingdom via small boat crossings of the English Channel increased sharply. In 2018, fewer than 300 people made the crossing. By 2019, that figure had risen to approximately 1,800. In 2020, it exceeded 8,400. By 2021, it crossed 28,000. The reasons for that increase are complex and contested. A combination of geopolitical instability, changes in smuggling routes following increased French enforcement elsewhere, and the relative accessibility of the Channel route from northern France. What is not contested is that the number of people requiring initial accommodation while their asylum claims were processed grew faster than the existing infrastructure could absorb. The conventional pathway for asylum seeker accommodation in Britain runs through a dispersal system, a network of private rented properties managed by contracted providers distributed across local authority areas according to a national dispersal scheme. The system operates on the principle that no single region bears a disproportionate share of the accommodation burden. By 2020, that system was under strain for reasons only partially related to the increase in arrivals. The supply of properties suitable for the dispersal scheme had been tightening for years, reflecting broader pressures in the private rented sector. Landlords who had previously contracted with accommodation providers were leaving the market. Local councils in dispersal areas were managing the social infrastructure consequences. School places, GP registration, social services referrals, with budgets that had absorbed a decade of constrained public spending. Then, the pandemic arrived. COVID-19 disrupted the asylum system at every level. The Home Office suspended many in-person asylum interviews. The immigration tribunal system slowed significantly. Processing timelines lengthened. At the same moment, the government introduced a policy, applied across several vulnerable populations, of not removing people from accommodation during the public health emergency. The effect was to freeze movement through the system at both ends. New arrivals continued, departures slowed, and the backlog of unresolved cases began to grow at a rate the dispersal network could not accommodate. Hotels entered the picture as what they were presented as. Spare capacity existed. The alternative, people without shelter, without sanitation, without food, was genuinely untenable. The initial decision to use hotel accommodation was defensible in the terms it was framed. The problem was not the emergency decision. The problem was what happened to the infrastructure built around it. Asylum seeker accommodation in Britain is not directly managed by the state. It is delivered through a contracted outsourcing model that has been the standard framework for Home Office accommodation provision since the early 2000s. The current contracts, known as AASC, the Asylum Accommodation and Support Contracts, were awarded in 2019 to 3 providers: Serco, Mears Group, and Clear Springs Ready Homes. These companies were responsible for sourcing, managing, and maintaining accommodation for asylum seekers across their respective regional areas. They operate within a framework set by the Home Office, which specifies standards, pricing mechanisms, and reporting requirements. The model has a structural logic. The Home Office lacks the operational capacity to directly manage accommodation at national scale. Contracting to specialist providers transfers operational complexity to organizations with existing property networks and management infrastructure. The approach is consistent with public procurement frameworks used across a range of government services. It also has a structural problem, which becomes visible when the volume of people requiring accommodation grows rapidly and unpredictably. The contracts are broadly occupancy-based. Providers are paid per person, per night. The incentive structure that results from this arrangement is not complicated. The longer a person remains in accommodation, the more revenue the provider receives. This does not mean providers actively obstruct processing or extended stays. It means that the financial architecture of the system does not contain the automatic mechanism for reducing cost as caseloads grow, and contains no penalty for growth itself. When hotel accommodation was added to the contract framework as an emergency supplement, the same occupancy-based logic applied. Hotels were contracted at rates that, by the Home Office's own published data, averaged between £95 and £150 per person per night across different regions and property types. Figures that include management fees, food provision, security, and contractor margin. The comparison with alternative accommodation models is instructive. The National Audit Office, in its 2023 report on asylum accommodation, calculated that the average cost of housing an asylum seeker in dispersal accommodation, standard rented housing within the contractor network, ran to approximately £10 to £15 per person per night, depending on location and property type. The differential between the managed house and the contracted hotel room, at scale, represents the core of the £2 billion figure. The shift from dispersal to hotel accommodation was therefore not cost neutral. It was an automatic structural cost amplifier, triggered by a genuine emergency, maintained by procurement architecture that had no self-correcting mechanism once hotel use became embedded. What the system lacked was not competent procurement officers or negligent ministers. What it lacked was a design that created pressure to exit the high-cost emergency mechanism once the acute phase of the emergency had passed. The decision to use hotels as asylum accommodation was made nationally. The consequences were experienced locally, and the two were not well coordinated. The operational footprint of the hotel program was not evenly distributed. Contracts followed available hotel capacity, which concentrated in particular types of location. Seaside towns with seasonal occupancy patterns, post-industrial towns with declining tourism, rural market towns where commercial hotel rates were lower, The result was that communities with limited existing public service capacity absorbed sudden, significant population increases with no formal mechanism for additional support. In Skegness, a coastal resort in Lincolnshire, the arrival of asylum seekers in local hotels during 2022 and 2023 generated sustained local friction. Not uniformly hostile, but consistently characterized by a gap between national policy and local preparation. The town's GP surgeries, already operating under the pressures that characterize primary care across much of England, had no advance notice of the scale of incoming residents requiring registration. The local council had no formal role in the procurement decision and no dedicated funding to manage the service consequences. That pattern repeated across dozens of similar locations. The Local Government Association documented it formally in 2023. Councils were absorbing the infrastructure costs of asylum hotel placements, referrals, safeguarding obligations, translation services, without the funding mechanisms that would normally accompany a population increase of comparable scale. Hotel owners occupy a particular position in this dynamic. The contracts offered to proprietors by the accommodation providers represented, for many smaller operators, income that was structurally more reliable than the commercial tourism market. A seasonal hotel with 40 to 60 rooms, generating variable occupancy across the calendar year, could achieve near full occupancy at a guaranteed nightly rate by entering the asylum accommodation supply chain. The financial incentive to extend those arrangements was clear and rational. The displacement effect on local tourism economies is difficult to quantify precisely. What local business associations in affected towns consistently reported was the perception, regardless of its measurable reality, that hotels contracted to the asylum system were unavailable to ordinary visitors, removing accommodation capacity from the local tourism offer and, in some cases, altering the visible character of town centers in ways that affected footfall. None of this involves bad faith from any individual actor. The hotel owner responds to available income. The contractor fills available capacity. The council manages the consequences with available resources. The national policy and its local effects are connected by procurement, but accountability for the connection belongs formally to no one. The most important question about the asylum hotel system is not how it grew, it is why, once the acute phase of the emergency had passed, it proved so difficult to scale back. The answer requires understanding the processing backlog, the number of asylum cases awaiting an initial decision, as a structural rather than an operational problem. In 2019, the outstanding asylum caseload in Britain stood at approximately 28,000 cases. By the end of 2022, it had grown to over 160,000. The increase reflects the combination of factors already described: rising arrivals, pandemic-related delays, and an adjudication system whose capacity had not expanded proportionally with demand. An individual whose asylum claim is unresolved cannot legally work, cannot access standard benefits, and cannot be allocated social housing. They must remain in Home Office-funded accommodation for the duration of the process. The length of that process is not determined by the accommodation system. It is determined by the decision-making capacity of the Home Office's Asylum Casework Directorate, the availability of legal representation, and the timeline of the Immigration Tribunal system. Once a claim is resolved, approved or refused, a further set of complications arises. Those granted leave to remain must transition out of asylum accommodation into the mainstream housing market. That market, particularly in the regions where asylum hotels are concentrated, is itself under severe pressure. Local authority housing waiting lists are long. The social housing stock available for new allocations is limited. The practical consequence is that individuals who have been granted the right to remain in Britain cannot immediately leave the accommodation system because there is nowhere for them to go. Those whose claims are refused face a different constraint. Removal from the United Kingdom requires documentation, travel arrangements, and, in many cases, engagement with the legal appeals process. The appeals system adds months or years to the timeline. During that period, the state retains a legal and humanitarian obligation to provide basic accommodation and support. The result is a system with multiple exit routes, each of which is obstructed by factors outside the accommodation mechanism itself. The hotel contract cannot expire faster than the processing system can clear its backlog. The backlog cannot clear faster than casework capacity allows. Casework capacity is a function of staffing, training, and system investment that operates on its own timeline. Meanwhile, the contractors operating under the current agreements have no financial incentive to advocate for system change. The existing arrangement delivers stable, government-backed revenue. The political risk of rapid reform, defined loosely as any change that might produce visible disruption, creates caution at ministerial level. The legal framework surrounding asylum rights creates constraint at the operational level. Each actor in the system responds rationally to the incentives they face. The aggregate result is institutional lock-in, a temporary measure that has acquired the structural characteristics of permanence because dismantling it requires simultaneous reform across multiple systems, none of which is under unified control. The £2 billion figure requires careful handling because it is both accurate and easy to misread. The Home Office's published spending on asylum accommodation crossed £1 billion annually for the first time in the financial year of 2021 to 2022. By 2022 to 2023, the total had reached approximately £1.6 billion. Projections for 2023 to 2024, incorporating the continued growth of the hotel estate and the expanded caseload, pushed the figure to over £2 billion. That total covers all asylum accommodation spending, not solely hotels, as well as support payments, management fees, and ancillary services. Hotels represent the fastest growing and highest unit cost component of the overall figure. But the £2 billion is a system-wide number. The National Audit Office, in its January 2023 report, broke the cost structure down in ways that are useful for comparison. The cost of the hotel program alone, at peak, was running at approximately £6 million per day. The cost per asylum seeker per year in hotel accommodation, based on published nightly rates and average occupancy periods, ran to between £35,000 and £45,000, depending on location and contract. For context, the full annual cost of supporting a person through the asylum system in a country with faster decision-making timelines and less reliance on hotel accommodation, the Netherlands for comparison, has been estimated at broadly half the British figure, driven largely by the difference in processing speed and the correspondingly shorter accommodation period. The growth trajectory is the critical variable. In 2015, total asylum accommodation spending in Britain was under £2 million. The tenfold increase over 8 years is not attributable to a single policy decision or a single year's arrival figures. It is the compound effect of processing delays, constrained housing supply, occupancy-based contracts, and the structural stickiness described above. Precision matters here. The £2 billion figure is not inflated for effect. It is the consequence of a design that scales costs upward automatically and does not scale them downward without deliberate, system-wide intervention. Perhaps the most structurally significant feature of the asylum hotel system is that no single institution is responsible for it in its entirety. The Home Office sets policy, manages the contracts, and owns the accommodation obligation. But the Home Office does not control processing speed, which is a function of casework staffing, legal frameworks, and tribunal capacity that spans multiple departments and independent judicial institutions. The contractors, Serco, Mears, and Clearsprings, manage accommodation within the parameters the Home Office sets. They are not responsible for how long people remain in the system. The financial exposure is limited by the contract terms. Their accountability to Parliament is indirect, mediated through their relationship with the contracting department. Local councils absorb the service consequences of placements made without their involvement. They have no formal authority over the accommodation contracts and no guaranteed mechanism for recovering the costs they incur. Their accountability runs to their local electorate, who experience the consequences directly but have no direct leverage over the national system producing them. The Treasury holds the spending authority and scrutinizes departmental budgets. But the Treasury's control over asylum accommodation costs is constrained by the legal obligations that generate them. The state's duty to accommodate asylum seekers pending resolution of their claims is not discretionary spending that can simply be reduced through budget negotiation. The courts, both the Immigration Tribunal and the higher courts that hear challenges to removal and detention decisions, make decisions that directly affect how long individuals remain in the accommodation system. Those decisions are made independently of any cost consideration, as they must be in a functioning legal system. The architecture that results is one in which every institution has legitimate authority over its own domain, and no institution has sufficient authority over the whole. When spending rises, each actor can point, accurately, to the constraints that prevent them from unilaterally reducing it. When accountability is sought, it is distributed across a structure too diffuse for any single line of responsibility to hold. This is not a conspiracy. It is not even, in the conventional sense, a failure. It is the predictable consequence of building an emergency response inside a governance architecture that was never designed to treat it as a unified system. Return for a moment to the Park Inn in Penrith. The hotel is still contracted, the rooms still occupied, the breakfast service still running for residents who arrived under emergency provisions that were, by the time this script was written, approaching their 4th year of operation. The building has not changed. What has changed is the status of the arrangement around it. No longer an emergency measure by any reasonable definition of that term, but not yet something that British public administration has found a clear alternative for. Temporary systems, if funded long enough, become permanent structures. The Asylum Hotel program did not become a £2 billion annual commitment because of greed or incompetence or ideological indifference. It became one because emergency procurement, occupancy-based contracts, a fragmented governance structure, and a processing system operating under its own constraints combined to produce a mechanism that expanded automatically and contracted only with extraordinary difficulty. The question worth sitting with is not whether the money was wasted. Some of it clearly was, at the margins and in the differential between what a hotel room costs and what a managed property costs. The more durable question is structural. When governments reach for emergency measures, what design principles would ensure those measures contain their own expiry conditions? The asylum hotel crisis is not, finally, a failure of immigration policy alone. It is a case study in what happens when the urgency of a crisis is used to justify procurement decisions whose long-term architecture nobody fully examined, and in how, once the architecture is built and funded, the institutions responsible for it find themselves unable to agree on who should be the one to take it apart.